long. Right?
Yeah. All right, let's get started. Arthur, that crocodile smile is alarmingly disconcerting. All right, let's get started. So as you know from the shir, we're dealing with a very specific issue. And that is, we were dealing with this issue where this guy felt a lot of frustration because he had to pay 400 zuz, which was a small fortune, because Rabbi Akiva says, why should a person be treated worse than a wealthy person? Because we have to see everybody as though they were an aristocrat that has lost their wealth. Why an aristocrat that has lost their wealth is because an aristocrat is accustomed to be treating well. And therefore we should be accustomed to treating all people well, because we are all the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what happens is there was this guy that pulled her hair covering off and bared her head in the marketplace, and she sued him, and she won 400 zuz. Okay, this guy was incensed. Why? Because he knew in nature that for a couple of coins she would probably bare her head. And what happened is he set up hidden witnesses, and he broke a jug of olive oil before her, and she uncovered her head to moisturize herself, because obviously we don't know the condition then. It wasn't exactly you went to Pick and Pay and bought shampoo. That oil was a tonic for the skin and for the hair, etc. So he comes to Rabbi Akiva and says, listen, for a few zuz worth of oil, an issa's worth of oil, she was prepared to bare her hair. Now she must earn 400 zuz. It's not fair. And Rabbi Akiva said, listen, you think you were trying to get pearls and get out of it? All you did was pick up shells under the seashore. That's about all you got. Because at the end of the day, you've got nothing to your case. And the reason being is that one who wounds himself, even though he's not permitted to do so, is exempt. Okay? Yet others who wound him are liable. Obviously, the Bryces said that he is permitted to wound himself, but we learned from that the definition meant to wound his ego, just to embarrass himself, but not to literally wound himself. So there's no contradiction with the Bryce and the Mishnah, as we learned from Rava. Okay, but the bottom line is, we learned this from a case, as we discussed yesterday, that even if you damage your own trees, and you're not permitted to do so, and in heaven they say you can't damage fruit trees or whatever, you're not liable to sue yourself. Let's put it that way. So you're exempt from payment. But yet, if other people see you do the same thing and think they can do it to you, they are liable. So therefore, even though the woman humiliated herself in public, you humiliated her, are liable for the full amount. So what analogy did I give yesterday? Lahavdil, is that we said that a person that sells her sexual services for money, a harlot, a prostitute, okay, so it's wrong, and she does that. But any guy that goes to court and said, listen, she doesn't value her body well, therefore I raped her, he would be just as liable for rape there as in another case. Is that fair? Well, the truth of it is, if you put yourself in a dangerous and promiscuous situation, you're probably more likely to endanger yourself. That's a fact. It doesn't take away culpability, but it's not a license to get off it. So you have a person that's into self-harm, that suffers from borderline personality disorder, a variety of disorders, mental, psychological, emotional, and they do self-harm. But it doesn't give them a right to be in an abusing relationship where others can do them harm. I think this should be fairly obvious, guys. I don't think it takes that much chokhmah. So we're on the page of 91b1. And it says, if one wounds himself, even though he's not permitted to do so, he is exempt. Our Mishnah indicates that it's not permitted to humiliate oneself either. So the Gemara says, this is what Rabbi Akiva was saying to the man. It's unnecessary to state regarding humiliation that even though one who humiliates himself, others who humiliate him are liable. For a person is permitted to humiliate himself. Therefore, the fact that the woman did not mind humiliating herself certainly does not exempt you from having humiliated her. But even regarding wounding, where a person is not permitted to wound himself, still others wound him are liable. So what it's saying is you've got to pick up the nuance here. You are permitted to humiliate yourself, but you shouldn't do so, and others are certainly not allowed to do it to you. But there is an opinion that says to humiliate yourself is not in the same level as to damage your body. We went through it last night. What is the reason, guys, that you cannot damage your body?
Because it doesn't belong to you.
Who
It belongs to
doesn't
Hashem.
Exactly.
Like a temple.
Exactly. It's exactly like a temple. Hashem has given you this chunk of meat that hopefully you keep in shape during your lifetime. You don't smoke, you don't drink. You keep it as a vessel to do mitzvahs with in the physical world, exactly as Gavin and Kevin have said. And therefore, you have no right to damage property that belongs to Hashem and not you. In terms of emotionally humiliating yourself, there was a part of a Muslim movement that used to do it, believe it or not. They would have people, Rabbi Dessler, I think, talks about it, that they'd have people that would go into a hardware store and ask for a sandwich press machine or something where the shop owner would shout at them. They would develop almost an immunity to being embarrassed. Now, I wouldn't recommend that because it takes a very brave person to be able to humiliate themselves like that and not slap the shopkeeper. So it's not for our generation. But certainly there is an opinion that you're not as culpable if you humiliate oneself. But bottom line is you shouldn't do either. But as far as wounding yourself is concerned, Shemaim will hold you responsible. But even if you do, it doesn't give anybody the license to do so. So the Gemara asks, and is a person indeed not permitted to wound himself? What was taught in a brisa, it could be thought that if one swore to harm himself and he did not harm himself, that he would be exempt. The Chumash therefore states to do bad or to do good. So the scriptural comparison teaches that just as the oath of utterance to do good refers to an optional matter, so to do the oath to if you make an utterance to do bad, that was also an optional matter. So thus include one who swore to harm himself and he did not harm himself. So it's almost using this as a proof to say, listen, you have to know that if you look in it's part in Ezekiel, please God, we're going to get to do it. It's in Shavuos in 27a. And it talks about an oath of an utterance. It's in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 5, verse 4. And it says, or if a person swears by uttering with the lips to do bad and to do good, anything that a person might utter in an oath, he is liable. So the statement that is counterintuitive is if you plan to do bad to somebody or to do bad to yourself or something, and then you stop yourself, surely it is praiseworthy. What do you have to bring a variable chatas offering for? Doesn't make sense. So what you've got to do is, this is almost used as a what do you call it, as a proof that you are allowed to wound yourself. So the Gemara is saying, listen, let's get a couple of matters clear. Yeah. Firstly, you're not allowed to wound yourself. We're talking about a separate issue. If you have to make a choice of doing bad in the world where you make an oath to get vengeance upon somebody and you don't, that is a good thing. There is a bad aspect about which you took an oath, what you're not allowed to do, and you broke that oath. But if you have to make a choice between making an oath to do bad and fulfilling it, it is far more spiritually devastating to you in the world than to bring a chatas variable offering. The only reason you bring a chatas variable offering is to realize that your word has an impact. And if you make an oath for something, an oath is taken seriously. But they by no means say that it's better to do the harm than to have a minor infraction of an oath broken. But this is not a proof to allow you to wound others nor yourself. So that's where we just want to clear it. So Shmuel said the phrase harm himself in the brisa can refer to a different matter, and that is where I will engage in a fast. So what do you mean? Somebody swears that he's going to fast, but then he violated his oath and he ate. So he's liable to a variable chatas offering because it's permissible to fast. So we look at a Nazir, and we said a Nazir is praiseworthy because he's abstaining from certain things. But in another opinion, he's actually not good because Hashem has allowed him certain things, and he's to himself added other stringencies and humras. And what this has meant is that he's now obligated to a higher standard. And now he's liable if he violates this standard. Hashem never put that pressure on him to start with, but now that he undertook it, it's a problem. Okay? So had he sworn to physically wound himself and failed to do so, it's obviously possible, according to Shmuel, that he wouldn't be liable to a chattas offering, because you can't make an oath on something that's forbidden, like to wound yourself. Okay, so the Gemara challenges the answer of Shmuel and saying, what do you mean engage in a fast? If it's so that harming himself is an engagement to promise yourself that you're going to do a fast, then surely it's a good thing, right? And the Brass's parallel case regarding harming others, if that means then engaging them in a fast, could be a good thing. You can engage others in a fast. Why? Because you're talking about a person that is maybe fasting because he wants to afflict himself with some sort of kapora. And therefore, he can only get into that state of mind of feeling regret, etc., if he puts himself in a state of fasting where he realizes how physically he needs Hashem in order to sustain his life. When you know Hashem sustains every minute of your life and breathing, I knew this when I was on the ventilator. Every now and again, one needs a reminder, not asking for one, I don't want one, just stating fact that these sort of things, one has to be careful what one asks for.
Absolutely.
I wanted, I just want to say thank you that I can breathe and eat. But having a fast, Kev, are you with us? You typing something?
No.
Okay.
I'm just looking at I got two screens here. That's right.
Okay. So what we say is a fast is not the end of the world. It's not, there could be a reason that one needs a kapora and get oneself in a mental and emotional state. So if it's a good thing for a kapora and for an atonement and vidui, why is it a sin to get somebody else to inflict themselves with a fast? It's not harming them. Okay, it's harming them if it's continual. I've often said with the Muslims, they fast for 40 days and they eat in between. They should carry it forward and really commit to it. Then our problems in the Middle East would be solved. But those are my personal opinions. It's not to say everybody shares it. If they fasted for 24
hours. Maybe stop the recording so you can edit that part out.
Listen, I learned things with woke and YouTube that as long as you say the politically incorrect things in the middle of the show, nobody's got the stamina to go through the show. We barely do.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, good.
So that's fair enough. So it's saying the Gemara answers, yes, you can. He can engage others in the fast, but it's got to be a case where it's presuming says, okay, so what about a case where he locks people in a room without food and says, guys, you need to do a kapara on yourself. So Gemara says, listen, this is not right. This is not what we're talking about. When you force somebody and harm others by saying that I'm going to put you in a room without food, that he might not be liable for violating his oath with a variable chattas offering, because you can't really harm somebody in this sort of manner. That's not engaging somebody in a fast. What it is getting communal agreement and saying, let's fast. It's not shoving somebody in a room and saying, you've been naughty, I don't like your character, you need to fast. That's psychotic. It's saying that you can't do. You know what I'm saying? But you wouldn't have to bring a variable chattas offering for that. So that's one thing that it brings in mind. The other thing it says, look, the Gemara rejected the answer and say, let's get to what's real here. Don't talk about what Shmuel said about a fast. Kevin, I see you falling asleep. You went for a run this morning, hey? Yeah, I can tell. You're fitter than all of us, and I don't blame you for being tired. After I go to the gym, I feel knackered. That's why I do it at night. You want to stretch a minute?
I'm fine.
Okay, you're just dozing a little. I don't mind. I'm used to it, but I just want you to enjoy the show. So The Gemara rejects the answer, saying, look, it was taught in a different section of exactly the same brisa. What's an example of an oath to harm others? Never mind locking them in a room without food. It says, I will strike so-and-so, and I will split his skull. Now, I don't know how many of you have felt this. I have felt it. So the first part of the brisa must be referring to physical injury. So we learn from the brisa that it's permitted for one to physically wound himself in contradiction to the Mishnah. That's what it's implying, the brisa. So the Gemara concedes the point and says, look, it looks like that if you're reading the brisa, but it's actually a dispute amongst the Tanaim, because there's one Tana who says, according to Rabbi Akiva, that a person is not permitted to wound himself. And there's another Tana who says, according to Rabbi Akiva, that a person is permitted to wound himself. In other words, previously, the Gemara had taken the stance that Rabbi Akiva maintains that it's forbidden to wound oneself at all, as our Mishnah quotes in Spain. What of?
Nothing.
Oh, okay. So the Gemara says, listen, we looked at Rabbi Akiva's opinion from the Mishnah. The brisa was a new thing. Now, what's happening is, how do you have a contradiction? Because we're talking about actual wounding. We're not doing as Shmuel is saying that it's talking about a fast, or about the other opinion that says it's talking about wounding one's ego. Okay?
Afflicting, you mean?
Yeah, no. When we say afflicting, it's using the word wound, but there's different ways to wound a person. You can wound a person by physically getting them in a state of hypoglycemia by afflicting them with a fast, or you can wound somebody's ego by afflicting them with humiliation. So, but to split hairs, we both kept saying exactly the same thing. But the only thing of it, Kevin, is that there's definitely a difference between the Gemara's stance and Rabbi Akiva with one of the Tanaim and the other stance with the Mishnah, who says you can't wound yourself. Okay? So the Gemara has adduced that a second brisa has come about, and it maintains that wounding oneself is permitted. It becomes reasonable to assume that the brisa cited at the end of this 91st stuff is actually precise, and that the brisa and the Mishnah reflect two different Tanaic versions to what Rabbi Akiva's opinion is saying. So in other words, the first one came to reconcile it, the first opinion, and said, listen, we're talking about wounding the ego. Shmuel came about and was trying to reconcile the brisa on the Mishnah and says it's talking about wounding oneself by afflicting oneself or others with a fast. Okay? And then this latest version is saying, look, we're clearly talking about somebody that's taking an oath to harm somebody and split their skull in two. That's not a light matter. That is proper wounding. And therefore, if he doesn't do that, yes, he does bring a variable chatas offering, perhaps, but it's nothing compared to being responsible for murder or permanent maiming and assault. It's just one's word is serious. Don't take an oath to such a thing. Okay. So the Gemara is trying to now identify the Tana who says, according to Rabbi Akiva, it's forbidden to wound oneself. That's what we're dealing with. So we look at Bereshit chapter 9, verse 5. Okay. And we're going to deal with this. And the Gemara says, who's the Tana that you hear him say that a person is not permitted to wound himself? Perhaps you will say that it's the following Tana, for it was taught in the brisa, the verse states, however your blood of your souls I will demand. Okay, that's in Bereshit. Rav Elazar says, from the hand of your souls I will demand your blood. I will extract retribution in the afterlife from the soul of a man who sheds his own blood. But this doesn't prove that wounding oneself is forbidden. Maybe, the Gemara is suggesting, killing oneself is different. Nothing can be derived from inflicting a non-fatal wound on oneself from there. Obviously, when one kills oneself or others, one has to have an accounting in Shemaim. We learn this from Cain and Abel. That's where we learn it from in Genesis. And we're talking about suicide as well, self-death. Either one is, what you're doing is you're taking your own hands and you're ending your spiritual mission or somebody else's spiritual mission in the world. And by the way, it's a definition of murder. There are certain opinions that there are categories of theft. One of them is adultery. because that's my wife, don't touch my wife. That's my life, don't touch my life. That's murder. They're versions of theft. That's my bike, don't touch my bike. That's proper theft. So, in other words, if you steal somebody's life, or you steal somebody's wife, or you steal somebody's bike, they're all acts of theft, although they seem under different categories upon analysis. That's all I'm saying to you. So, we can say that for sure there's in Genesis an instruction that Hashem, who's the master of the universe, will hold us accountable for murder of others and ourselves. But there's no indication that a non-fatal wound upon oneself is you held spiritually accountable to the same level. So it's the following Tana, because it was taught in a brisa: we rend garments for the dead and do not entail a violation of the prohibition to follow in the ways of the Amorites. What do we mean? So if you look at Leviticus chapter 18, verse 3, you shall not follow the Canaanites' customs. And it's in Gemara Shabbos in 67a, according to Rashi, and in Shmot in Exodus chapter 23, verse 24, and you shall not act according to the Canaanites' practices. So obviously there's much discussion as to the exact nature of the prohibition. We know that we grow payas because we don't look like the idol-worshipping priests the way we shave our hair. We don't rend our garments, we tear them, but we don't do self-inflicted harm. They used to do bodily harm as a mourning process. So the Amorites were one of the Canaanite nations, and even the practices of other the Amorites or other Canaanite nations are prohibited because it's a form of idolatry. So you can't rend your clothes for the dead in the same way. Okay, so the only issue is that I know that when I lost my mom, one cuts their garment and they tear it. So that to me seemed quite similar. So I didn't know how that was allowed. Apparently, there's an opinion by the Torah Chaim that reconciles those two passages. If you've got time, you can go through it. I don't even know. So, okay. So what we're saying is here is I've heard that the one who rends his clothing for the dead more than what is necessary, according to the law, is flogged for violation of the prohibition, you shall not destroy. Okay? So what we're saying is here, in the passage concerning the laws of warfare, in Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 19, it says, when you besiege a city for many days to wage battle against it, to take it, you shall not destroy its trees. It's interesting. So, as evidence from the Gemara, there's a prohibition that you shall not destroy. It applies even in non-warfare situations, and not only to trees, but to all useful items. Okay? So, why do we mention war? Because war is an extreme situation where you want to cause attrition. You generally, during the Boer War, the British were very cruel, and they wanted to starve the Boers by scorched earth tactics. So we're saying that even that sort of thing you generally shouldn't do. Okay, so according to like Derisa, you're not really liable to lashes for destroying items other than trees, but it's generally a rabbinic punishment, which is also very, very serious. Okay, so the Gemara suggests maybe clothing is different because it's an irreversible loss when they're damaged. It's possible, therefore, that Rav Elazar permits one only to ruin his clothes, but basically permits one to wound himself. So let's examine what this means. So there was a practice of Rav Yochanan who used to refer to his clothes as those things that honor me. And Rav Chisda, who, when he would walk among the thorns and thistles, would lift the hems of his clothing and expose his legs to the thorns, because he said in the explanations, these are my legs, they heal. You get a couple of scratches, but they heal. But my garment, this doesn't heal. So what are we talking about here? Is we're saying that tearing clothes could be included in the prohibition of not to destroy, because clothes can serve a permanent damage, like staining or whatever. So like I remember when I was younger, my dad, if we'd eat strawberries, Kevin, or or mulberry. You know those mulberry trees? He'd put my brother and I in the bowl in the bath, and we'd have a bucket of mulberries, and we'd eat it, and we'd get all stained, and we'd wash and whatever. But he didn't trust us at 6 and 8 with our clothes. Believe me, it would leave a permanent marking. So this is what it's talking about here: is that Kev, you're so falling asleep. But do you want to
No, I'm
stay?
not.
I can.
It's
Gav,
the light.
yeah, I say that to the. I used
The
to say
light in
that
my
at school.
glasses. No, I'm not.
Okay. Gav, is he falling asleep at all or not? Because
I'm not actually watching him. I don't have it on all four. I'll do that. I'll be
Okay,
your
watch
backup.
now.
Okay, now I can watch.
No, it's the light. I think it's
okay,
probably the reflection of okay.
it must also
Maybe I
create.
was. I don't think I was.
No, it's
I
fair
just hope
enough.
it's not contagious now.
It must also create like a heavy head a lot.
You know, the worst part is you don't think
Okay.
you were, and you're not sure. That's even worse than anything else.
You know, I do it like Arthur, who looks like he's asleep and sometimes is awake. Arthur probably wore in school those glasses where you had those bug eyes, and you could see the person
Yes.
was awake like that, and you take it off, and the person was asleep. So what
But
we say.
the thing is,
So,
yeah,
guys, what we're saying, because I still want to give Kevin a chance to teach. I'm watching the clock carefully. Is that bodily wounds heal? So, what we're talking about here is a case where Rav Chisda would basically lift the hem of his clothing and say, "Okay, the thorn scratched me a bit, but in a week or two I'll heal." But it's not like you could go into Mr. Price Gav and just buy a shorts for like $50 then. In those days, it had to be sewn. There was no industrial revolution. It was very expensive, and it was rare to have multiple clothing. So there, you would rather scratch yourself a little bit, let yourself heal, than damage your clothing. What I'm saying is, I remember being young, and in the mulberries, when we would eat mulberries, my dad would make sure that we would eat them in the bath. It was during bath time, so that at the end of the day, if we got a purple stain or whatever, it'd come off in a day or two, but it wouldn't ruin expensive clothing. So it's saying maybe you permitted to wound yourself instead of ruining your clothing. And it uses this particular example because body can heal, but clothing doesn't. And this is saying, well, maybe this is a heter that in certain circumstances you can wound yourself. You get what I'm saying? So, right, all right. So I just want to read on. We're not that far away, and then Kevin will teach us. Okay. So the Gemara therefore suggests that another Tana is the source of the view that is prohibited to wound itself, rather than the following Tana, for it is taught in the Brisa. Ravelaza Akapar Baribi said, "What does the Torah teach when it states concerning the Nazir, and he shall atone for him, for he has sinned against the soul?" Now, I remember Rav Simcha Steinhauer was mentioning sometimes this issue with the Nazir in one of the Pashas, that there is an atonement for a Nazir because he's taken on extra obligations for himself. And we don't have the Catholic position of abstinence, because if you fail to address your sexual drives in a kosher way, you're going to fiddle with little boys. That's what's going to come from it, believe me. So naturally, this is not made the Haredi Shir list of the year because we say things in our mouths. But the truth of it is, it never happened in a vacuum. That in Boston, the Boston Globe had an expose on the Catholic Church that they were hiding this for years, because you cannot remove drives. You can only focus drives. So Nazir is taking on drives at which we're not prohibited to have. We're not Muslims. We can drink alcohol, just everything in moderation. Obviously, if there's a sexual addiction, or if there's an addiction where you're a alcoholic, a normal person can go to a bar, have a drink, and stop. If an alcoholic won't stop, he can't. If somebody's got a sex addiction, one can't. But those are extreme cases, but everything in moderation. So the Nazir has to give an accounting against sinning of his soul. And against which his soul did this man sin? Rather because he deprived himself of wine when he's considered to have sinned against his own soul. Okay? So now we're also referring to this case of Rav Elazar HaKapar, who continues, now, is this a matter not a kol v'chomer? If the Nazir, who deprived himself only of wine, is called a sinner, someone who deprives himself of all things, in other words, all foods, all drinks, he fasts, how much more so is he a sinner? That's what the Gemara is proposing. Since Rav Elazar Kapar holds that it's prohibited for a person to cause himself pain through abstinence, it follows that he would also hold that it's prohibited to wound himself with a fast. So he's saying, listen, if a Nazir is held accountable only for withholding wine, somebody that fasts and withholds himself from everything for sure is even more liable. That's a kol v'chomer. So he's the Tana that says you can't wound yourself. Kevin, there are other Tanoim that say that you can afflict yourself with a fast if you've got a reason to. You've done something bad and you want to do a kapara or whatever, but you have to take your physiology into account, pre-existing medical conditions, and you cannot have a temporary wound end up being a suicide. All right, on this note, I hope the show was decent. Kevin, teach us.
Okay, so now we can continue about the theme of distancing oneself from false words and deceit, etc. So, the Menorah's Hama Or, in Perek 19, writes, a deceitful person is considered like a dead man because people do not reckon with his words, since he is accustomed to lying. His life and death are the same. Our sages in Sanhedrin 89b said, this is the punishment of an impostor. Even if he says the truth, people do not listen to him. When Yirmiyahu the prophet admonished the Jewish people, he only admonished them about deceit, as it is written. They train their tongue to speak falsehood, striving to be iniquitous. After they trained their tongues to speak falsehood, it became like their very nature, and they were unable to depart from it. And they tired from attempting to abandon the way of falsehood for the way of truth. The prophet Yirmiyahu complained that the people of his generation repeatedly lied and trained their tongues to lie until falsehood and deceit became normative. And then there's a story about the boot factory in Lodz in Poland, Lodz, Lodz. That's how you spell it, pronounce it. A man who was modeled on integrity and honesty demanded no less from his family. Indeed, he seemed he was incapable of speaking a false word or insincere compliment, and could not tell a lie even when his very life depended on it. His early years were nurtured. So I think I'm trying to say it in the second or third person. It says, okay, he says, my early years, I think he's talking, this is the son talking, were nurtured in the Neve Achiezer neighborhood in Bnei Brak, which was built for survivors of the Shoah. While many of the neighbors were shattered people, haunted by their nightmares, they nonetheless radiated trust in Hashem and faithful hope for a better future in the land of Israel. Among them was Rav Manis Zitnitsky Zatzal, whose first wife and 6 children perished in the camps. When it became clear that he and his second wife would not be blessed with children, they dedicated themselves to building Yeshivas Imre Emes in Bnei Brak. I recall that for as long as we lived nearby, I visited Rav Manis's home every Shabbos to kugel and be tested on the parsha. Even when I objected, preferring to play with friends, my father insisted that I visit the Rav to alleviate the sorrow of his childlessness. Not understanding why it was solely my responsibility, I obeyed, sometimes grudgingly. Only after Rav Manis died did my father share the secret of the odd bond between our families. At the height of World War II, the Germans established a factory in the Lodz ghetto to manufacture fur-lined boots for their pilots, who often returned from their bombing missions with frostbitten feet. The Germans turned the ghetto into a large forced labor camp, but in their zeal to secure the safety of their pilots, they gave the Jewish shoemakers free rein in choosing their laborers, as well as better conditions and food, because of the urgent need for fur boots, not because they cared about them. There was one condition: all of the workers had to be, there was one condition, that all the workers had to be professional shoemakers. Anyone hiring unqualified craftsmen would be killed immediately. My father risked his life and stuck into the factory trying to join a work team. Production was managed in groups of about 10 men, of 10 men for each group producing a pair of boots from start to finish. My father related, I approached the first group and asked if they needed another worker. The foreman raised his head and asked me if I'm a shoemaker. I shook my head and he rebuked me and demanded that I immediately go away. This scenario repeated itself several times as I dashed from group to group in the large warehouse. Time was running out, and I feared the Nazi guards who periodically patrolled the factory. Desperately, I decided to approach two more groups. The first one rejected me. I would lie to the last group and claim that I was a professional shoemaker. As I approached the next group, again, they asked if I needed a shoemaker, and they said, "Are you a shoemaker?" I said, "No." As I whispered, "No," the man looked at me again with a staring eye, and he said, "Look, young man, go over to the barrel filled with boot black and stir it well to prevent coagulation. Put your hands in it and mix it and mix the paint well." Relieved yet hesitant, I put my right hand in to mix the paint, and after several minutes of stirring, the foreman asked me to show him my hands. When he saw that my left hand was clean, he chastised me and said that this work requires mixing with both hands. After a few more minutes of stirring with both hands, he asked me again to show him my hands and declared with his satisfaction, "Now you are a professional shoemaker, and go join the group." At that moment, a German guard approached our group and asked, "I was told someone entered the factory without permission. Did you see him?" Neither the group responded. "He is right here next to me. He is a professional shoemaker and I requested his services." The German nodded his head approvingly and let me be. So I stayed in the bead factory and my life was spared. Just 30 more seconds here. Then my father fixed his gaze on me and said, "Do you know who was in charge of that group?" It was none other than Rabbi Manis Zitnitsky, in whose merit I remained alive. Shocked, I remained silent for a few minutes, finally comprehending why Rav Manis would occasionally refer to me as his grandchild. After a few more minutes of reflection, I could not resist and ask my father why he did not lie immediately and say he was a shoemaker, since no one would be able to verify his claim. With a puzzled expression, my father explained, "But I was not a shoemaker. I was awestruck by his simple and matter-of-fact answer. Even when his very life was at risk, he could not bring himself to utter falsehood and decided that only when all the alternatives were exhausted, having no other choice, would he lie and say that he was a